Well, one of the first things you're supposed to do as a speaker is tell a joke. So I'll tell a very short joke. This man goes into a psychiatrist's office and says, "Doctor, I have schizophrenia." To which the psychiatrist looks at him and says, "Good, that makes 4 of us." And if you think of it, that's almost enough for group therapy.
That's true.
But mental health is not funny. Sigmund Freud never told a dirty joke, and he never told a craziness joke. He knew a lot of jokes, and he knew a lot of funny anecdotes, but those subjects he avoided. He even wrote a very good book on the psychology of humor. It's quite good. Sanity and sex and their interrelation was a very serious matter to him. It still is a serious matter. In our society, 1 in 10 people will spend some time in a psychiatric institution during the course of their life. From a mystical point of view, it's likely to get worse before it gets better, because of the way we use our consciousness. Psychological problems are even more serious from a spiritual point of view. I can, but I never do go to a medical hospital. My thought is that's a 12th house matter, and the 12th house is where you should retreat and think about things. If a person is lying in a hospital bed and asking the question, "Why me?" if he's not bothered by other people and he listens and asks that question for real, he may very well get an answer. Because we know from cause and consequence, everything that happens to us for a reason. There's a lot of suffering in a medical hospital. And suffering is a very strong motivation for inward searching. If I go to a mental hospital, I'm the one that suffers. And the reason for the suffering is that most of the patients can't know the truth. And that is very sad. Drunks are not funny for that same reason. You can't know the truth. To know the truth is one of our greatest blessings. The Madam said, "There is no religion higher than the truth." Now, in this talk, we're going to very briefly and superficially discuss some of the problems of psychic health from a mystical point of view. And it should be familiar to you because it'll be along the lines of the Theosophical doctrine. And the title for the talk is Psychic Health and Insanity. And we'll work our way into the subject by looking at the 3 main terms in the title. Now, it has been said that the best art is invisible. That doesn't mean it shouldn't have been created, or that the best art is all about the invisible worlds. It means that the art doesn't stand in the way of the beauty. The beauty can shine through it unimpeded by the vanities of the artist. Our bodies, all of them, our physical body, our etheric body, emotional and mental, are also our creations. We have co-created them in collaboration with the gods and the divine spiritual hierarchies, which in the Bible are called the Elohim. The chief difference between our bodies and paintings and other works of art is that we live in our bodies. We live in our creations, and we experience how well our creative work went. If we're in good health, we barely know we have organs in our body. But if you have a kidney stone, there's no doubt that you have kidneys. There can also be no doubt that one is an imperfect creator, because sometimes the pain of conditions in our body is so intense and so constant that we can think of almost nothing else. Emerson said, "A sick man is a sinner found out." From this, we can see that health is a matter of function. If we are in health, it means that our bodies are functioning perfectly. They are in harmony with the laws of nature and the way we have used them in building our bodies. Illness, then, helps us to see where we are out of harmony with the cosmos. And it offers us the opportunity to realign ourselves with the laws of nature. Astrology, if you study astrology really well, it helps you to understand what divine principles or what divine spiritual hierarchies are being misused. Now, these are all very fascinating things, but they're much too deep to go into for a superficial talk like this. Now, much of what has been said applies to psychic health, but there is one very big difference, which is almost an inversion from physical health. It was just noted that there's no doubt if you have an illness, if you have a physical condition. But it's not always that way with psychic health, whether it is mild or whether it's severe. Anyone who is self-aware enough to question his or her sanity probably is sane. On the other hand, deeply disturbed individuals are confident there's nothing wrong with them. And I've had a lot of interactions with them. And this is one of the great tragedies of losing the capacity to know the truth. Spiritually, on the lintel of one of the Greek mystery schools, the words were chiseled in, "Gnothi se auton," know thyself. The capacity of self-knowledge is lost in or damaged in mental health situations. And that's very sad. You can't even know yourself. It also makes therapy more difficult, which is even sadder. It's not bad to have a condition, but to not be able to correct it is much more difficult. All right, that's looking at health. Now let's turn to another of the three words in the title and see what we can bring up with that. In this case, we're talking about psychic. And when we bring that subject up, it's a much different kind of a problem. It is a problem that is basically semantic, and it is a social problem in the use of words. Some words take on many, many different meanings, and often in a meaningful conversation you have to spend a lot of time defining terms. So we live in some kind of a spiritual Babel. The word psychic is what is called a garbage can word because it collects all sorts of meanings and conditions and things like that. It piques a lot of interest, which is the reason I put it in the title, but it is unclear what it means. Its origin isn't very helpful in learning it. It's from a Greek word, which is roughly the same as our word soul, which is even more of a garbage can word. So to get at what we're trying to get at, we have to be more precise about the meaning of soul or psyche. There are quite a few different usages, but there are three major usages. The most common is what might be called, is in street language that it's used. And this usage of soul has it equivalent to individuality, or to individual spirit, or spiritual ego, or whatever term you choose. When we say things like Mary is a good soul, we are referring to this definition. Or when we say animals as yet have no soul, we're using this definition of the word soul. But that's not the definition we're going to use in this talk. There is also a more specific, even technical meaning for the word soul that is used by mystery schools. In this definition, soul is the essence of experience in the struggle between spirit and matter. It is spiritualized matter or matter on the way to spiritualization. In the mysteries, soul is even more specific. In essence, experience of the world of desires, emotions, and feelings is called emotional soul. Soul material from the experience in the ethers of life and sense perception and things like that is called intellectual soul. And conscious soul is what is gleaned from physical interactions with the world. In short, we're waking up by struggling or pounding on the world or having it pound on us. Different schools have different names. I'm sorry I don't know the names that are used in theosophy because it's been a long time since I studied that. Now, when we say something like Sadius is a soulful man, we're usually relating to emotional soul in his makeup. But that definition is also not what we're using. The definition that we're using in this talk is more Aristotelian in nature. It is taken from the triad of body, soul, and spirit. In brief, this definition of soul is everything between the dense physical body and the transcendent spirit. Now, since you're all theosophists, this is easy to relate to. We are spiritual beings. We are creative truth knowers. And we're participating in an almost unbelievably complex evolutionary creation. And in this evolutionary creation, we begin as potential spirits with undifferentiated material counterparts in cosmic conditions that are much, much different than they are now. In short, we pass from a purely material condition to divinity. It is, as the old statement goes, we pass from clod to God. But it is an extremely slow spiral evolutionary process. And the conditions of the cosmos are continuously changing. So that adaptability is one of the chief assets in spiritual evolution. And each of these different conditions brings out a different facet of the spirit. And the spirit is capable of infinite facets. Now, in this work, we develop tools or vehicles of consciousness or bodies to accomplish this work. We have this dense physical or chemical body, which is what most people think that is all there is to human being. They think, well, if we had a different breakfast, we'd have a different outlook on life because it's all a matter of chemistry and the brain. We don't think that way. We know better than that. Interpenetrating the dense physical body is an etheric body. It vitalizes it, and it conveys the outward experiences of the physical world inward to the spirit and to the higher vehicles. And interpenetrating the etheric vital body is the desire body, which is an emotional body, and it's in a completely different world. The desire world and the world of thought and the physical world are all very different worlds. They relate to each other by a resonance, and what we live in is very much a musical cosmos, but they're different worlds. The function of the desire nature, primarily at this stage of evolution, it's motivation. Without motivation, we don't activate the etheric vital body. If we don't activate the etheric vital body, the physical body is just a lump and there's no experience. Within the desire body is a concrete mind. And at this time in our evolution, the self, the spiritual nature, interpenetrates the concrete mind and in that way works its way into all of our vehicles. We are not guided from without like a little race car or something like that they do with those handheld devices. Now, these we know are the findings of highly developed spiritual seers who have checked and rechecked their spiritual observations, and they have corroborated each other. And so that in spiritual things there is as much science as there is in physical things. So material science doesn't have a corner on science at all. So, to get back to topic, from this we can see that we have body, soul, and spirit. And in this definition of soul, it is everything between the spirit and the dense physical body. So the soul worlds, which are extremely fluid compared to this physical world, even the gases and the liquids or fluids in this world are nothing compared to the fluidity of changes that happen inwardly in the inner worlds. The communication between them is accomplished resonantly. So when Hamlet asks, or when King David asks, what is a human? This is the answer that is given by people like ourselves, people who study the mysteries. And it is as good a definition of a human as any that I've ever encountered. A human being is a spiritual being, a truth knower, a creator that creates thoughts, and thoughts spur emotions, and emotions motivate actions, and actions precipitate experiences in form. In a reverse perspective, we experience things in the world impactfully. Even the light that strikes our eyes is an impact that gets carried through the ethers into the desire nature, and we get the feel of what it means. From there, it is passed on to the thought to try to understand what the meaning is, and from that it enters into the spirit, and in such a cycle of going out and coming back in, the spirit gets to know the reality in which it lives and gets to transform it and understand whether its creation has been successful or not. So that's the definition of soul we're using. Now, all of these bodies and worlds, for the most part, are extremely fluid. They are created by spirit in the macrocosm. And everything in the individual, as we have adapted from the macrocosmic desire world or from the macrocosmic world of thought, has character. We give it our own character from our own experience and our own creativity. But even the worlds themselves have character. Some people in the more ancient philosophies, in a very beautifully artistic way, describe each of the worlds and the subdivisions within the worlds as in terms of character. All right, that's a little bit about psychic, and now all that's left is to talk about insanity. If you talk to someone on the street, the most common definition of insanity relates to rationality. To be sane is to be rational. To be insane is to be irrational. Now, seers tell us that the animal kingdom has not developed a concrete mind. So the individual spirit has not been differentiated, and it cannot work through the vehicles of the mind and self-consciously know truth. So there is in this the idea that if a person is irrational, they're somewhat animalistic. Now there's something to that, but that's sort of a vague view of sanity and insanity. Irrationality in mental illness is not as real as it seems to be. Psychiatrists in mental hospitals and places like that are all materialistic. And they call the statements from so-called crazy people, they say they have crazy talk. As far as I can see, it isn't crazy at all. It just has a different frame of reference. And that frame of reference is usually often very personal. Now, Sigmund Freud, and especially Carl Jung, found the same thing, that crazy talk has rational meaning. However, it has to be interpreted. For example, if someone is diagnosed in what the materialistic psychiatrists call a delusional paranoid schizophrenic, that individual has all sorts of claims of grandiose accomplishments and associations that cannot possibly be true. So their claims have to be interpreted. And I've worked with a few of them. One of them actually even wanted to murder me in one of those wards where you go through 2 locked doors to get in. And what that person is saying is probably saying, I'm not worth shit. I really think I am worthless, and I think I am unloved. But if people will believe all of these things about me that I am projecting, then I will be validated, and then I will be loved, and then I will be accepted. The delusional paranoid is the kind of person that has that kind of a makeup. It's very difficult to get them to humbly accept themselves for what they are, and then when you can, they become lovable beings. Now, if you develop a rapport and you dig deeply enough, everything they say can be interpreted. And that interpretation is a pathway to healing. If you can bring that paranoid schizophrenic to humbly accept what he is, then he can build on himself and eventually find out that he's not so bad after all. And if it's done realistically, he can eventually even realize that he is a divinity. So from all of this, we understand that rationality, or what society thinks rationality is not a really good definition for insanity. Now, mysticism, such as theosophy, has a very clear definition of insanity. Insanity is when there is a definite and total break in the vehicles of consciousness so that the spirit cannot get through to the outer physical world, and it cannot bring back from the outer physical world information to the spirit, to the truth knower. Now, there are problems with this definition, but overall, that's pretty excellent. And you can't get through, and, it can't get back to you. One of the problems with this is that it takes a very well-trained and practiced clairvoyant to be able to make such a diagnosis. And there are very few such people around. Now, if you have a really good intuition, and it's just not psychic sensitivity, you can do pretty well in understanding whether that is present. Now, this kind of a diagnosis is really important, because if it is truly insanity, it cannot be healed. And you have to come to rebirth again with a reconnected set of vehicles before you can have sanity. So this is not really dissimilar from when a psychiatrist says that there's a difference between neurosis and psychosis cannot be cured. All you can do is drug them up so that they aren't violent. I am convinced that well-trained clairvoyance is necessary for any sure psychological diagnosis. For example, you can't tell whether a person is really schizophrenic or whether the person is possessed without clairvoyance. There was a famous psychiatrist in New York City named Nandor Fodor, And Nandor Fodor was the materialistic. He was a Freudian to begin with, and Freud was a atheist and a complete materialist. And eventually, some things didn't make sense to him, and he found out in various ways that some schizophrenics were not schizophrenics, but that they were possessed individuals. In another thing, you can't tell whether the character is fractionating into constellations or whether the person is a medium and is possessed by a number of entities coming and going. We have that story from the Bible when Jesus confronts this man who has so many entities coming in and out of him that they're called legion. There are that many. Now, sometimes in the post-mortem purgatory, when all of our bodies disintegrated, and we take out all of the experience for those bodies and use it to create our next character, our next rebirth, sometimes we are unable to disintegrate the desire body, especially if the desire nature is very hardened. It doesn't change. It doesn't want to change. In such a case, in the next rebirth, around puberty, when the new desire body is activated, the old one from a previous rebirth comes and struggles for control of the personality. In psychology, there is a term for that. It's a special kind of schizophrenia. It used to be called dementia precox, but now it is called juvenile schizophrenia. And unless you have the clairvoyance, you cannot tell what, and it has to be a well-trained clairvoyance, you cannot tell what is going on in a person. I have a friend who was an experimenter, and from age 12 until he died in his 50s, he never had a sober month. And he took every kind of drug you can think of. He was hooked on heroin, hooked on cocaine, took angel's dust, took LSD, ended up being an alcoholic. And he tampered, he messed around with a sort of chancy negative clairvoyance. And he came to me one day and he said, I just saw something that was impossible. He said, I saw a person who did not have an aura. And he says, is that possible? And I said, maybe. What happens is, by clairvoyant research, they find that after you see your life backwards when you leave your body in what is called death, you absorb all of the experience of the etheric and physical body into your desire nature. And it then takes on the form of the physical body because it inherits that structure. Now, if such an individual like that pushes somebody out of their body and takes over, there wouldn't be an aura outside. And this friend didn't know that at all. That's what happens if you don't have knowledge. Now, there's plenty of testimony to support this view of insanity in folk language. People know. Like Carl Jung writes some very interesting pieces on the psychiatry of rumor and of gossip. For example, in folk language we say, I can't get through to him. Or, he's not all there. Or, we say he has lost his senses. Or, we say he is withdrawn or flipped out. Now, those statements are true, but they're not very precise. So it indicates that there's some general vague understanding in humanity, but it isn't really good. Now, the second problem that comes up with the mystical view of psychic health and of insanity is that this interpretation is very severe, and you have to be careful about using the term break, complete and total break between the vehicles. This is very important because the psyche and all of the vehicles in it are very elastic. And in the inner worlds, there's all kinds of kingdoms that you can put your consciousness into, and they aren't necessarily insane. So that we may stretch our consciousness in a way that, and focus it in a way so that we are extremely eccentric, or we are pointing very much in a different direction, but that doesn't mean we are insane. So by telling someone that they're insane when they are not, but just that they are in an extreme state of psychological development, that can be very detrimental. And the image that people have of themselves can be very much taken down by that. It's not, it's not nice to tell somebody that you're crazy, because it can have a really hard effect on them. All right, we now understand the three terms in the title, and let's look at some very simple and very obvious examples to get a rough idea of all of this. Now, please remember, these examples are very gross, and there are many variations. But suppose there is a break between the etheric vital body and the dense physical body. That condition is called death. You certainly obviously have to be reborn to have a full set of vehicles again. If the break is between the desire body and the vital body, the spirit and the mind and the desire body are hovering around, but because of the break, the vital body and the physical body are left behind. And in mystical terms, that is basically a vegetable. That is someone with no motivation, which is very common in many cases of extreme psychological duress. If the break, if it is a full break, is between the mind and the desire body, the spirit and the mind have nothing left to control what is left behind. And it becomes an animal, or worse than an animal. It is somebody that is a maniac with desire and uncontrollable. Now, there are sometimes breaks between the spirit and the mind, but they are exceedingly rare. And they are very dire, because once the spirit loses control of the mind, it loses control of all of the history and everything that has happened through the entire evolution as we've gone through a mineral-like, a plant-like, animal-like, and human-like state. It's extremely severe. It produces a monstrosity. Now, if you read one of Madame Blavatsky's favorite books, A Strange Story, she describes that very thing. She doesn't describe it, but Bulwer Lytton, who wrote A Strange Story, describes that thing happening. And in one paragraph, he describes the spirit leaving the personality behind, and I don't know how that man could put those words right in such a short paragraph. This is the same man that wrote It Was a Dark and Stormy Night. He wrote some great books, though. If you've ever read Zanoni, have any of you ever read Zanoni? A wonderful book. You should probably have it in your library here. If you don't, I'll look around and see if I have a copy, and I will send a copy over to you. All right. Rebirth is no longer possible if the break is between the spirit and the mind. Now, not so severe breaks can also happen in subregions of the bodies. Some of them are breaks and some of them are distensions. Sometimes extremely materialistic attitudes cause a break or a pseudo break between the lowest ether and the three higher ethers. This often happens when you practice breathing exercises, thinking materialistically that you can breathe yourself into heaven, which you can't do. And it produces a break between what is called the chemical ether and the three higher ethers, and it results in a hardening process in the constitution. Not physical like bone hardening, but psychophysical hardening. And that's called tuberculosis, which comes out of that. So there are all sorts of different places that you can make breaks, and not all of them are pathological. For example, if you want to leave the body, you have to be able to put your consciousness into the two higher ethers of the etheric body and go with that into the inner worlds, because the desire body is not as well organized and it does not have as long of an evolution behind it. And so if you have the etheric soul body separated from the physical body, which process is called stratification, that's a healthy thing. That's what we endeavor to do. That's what spiritual exercises like retrospection and things like that do. They not only harvest the experience out of our daily lives, but they put them into the higher ethers as soul material, and one can leave the body. So there are too many different kinds of breaks or stresses that can be put on the higher bodies. Sometimes you can focus in various regions excessively. Suppose you focus in the highest subdivision of the ethers, which in Rosicrucian parlance is called the reflecting ether. At the negative pole, you have what in theosophy is called the Akashic memory. And at the positive pole, you have the ability to carry out thoughts that are projected from the mind and carry out all the ramifications of them. Suppose you're focused there, and you're focused in the lowest part of the desire world, which is ruled by Saturn, which has all kinds of fear and things like that. So then you have the description of someone who is fearful and suspicious and has all these logical trains, like that man across the street is signaling to the FBI, and the FBI has a radio to the CIA, and the CIA is feeding the information to the ETs in the UFO, and they're all after me. And if you look at the different functions of the different parts of your inner constitution, it's fairly easy to see where a person is focused with his consciousness. So there are as many states of psychology as there are people. And we can't go into all of them. It's not simple to always understand psychological illness, and healing it is extremely difficult when it is possible. So we have roughly looked at psychic health and insanity and psychic malinformation, and let's look to preventative measures, because we all want to live sane and healthy lives We want to be productive. We want to contribute to the wonderful thing which we are privileged to be part of. And after years of study and observation, I have come to the understanding that there are 4 cornerstones of psychic health. The first factor is difficult to deal with, not only because it's a very controversial subject, but because it's so easily misunderstood. And it is also paradoxical. The paradox is that in one way, it is extremely neutral, and in another way, it is not neutral at all in value. All force is neutral. You can take the force in a flashlight and you can use it to guide somebody's way, or you can use the flashlight to rob somebody as a second-story man or something like that. So the force itself is neutral, but is highly charged. What we're speaking of here is the force that is used for all magic, whether it is white magic and healing or creation, or black magic and harm. At the same time, it is the most sacred and the most profane energy that we have. It is the force that creates, sustains, transforms, and dissolves the cosmos. We have in us something that creates, sustains, transforms, and dissolves the cosmos and whatever we do with it that is available to us. We have a portion of that available to us according to what we've done in our past lives. In theosophical terms, it is called Kundalini. Freud called it libido. He looked at the more psychological side of it. And it is called life force by Christian mystics. I don't want to be a moralist, so I won't go in that direction. It's just enough to say that it is sacred, that it is extremely hard to control, and that it is our destiny to use it as co-creators. And it has the most severe kinds of cause and consequence reactions. Each one of us has our part of it. Now, Freud was a genius, but you didn't have to be a genius to see that sexuality was behind a lot of mental problems. If you go to a mental ward, it doesn't take but a few minutes to realize that, hey, these people have really severe sexual problems. And they don't know anything about controlling that energy. And sadly, we have people who contain that energy but aren't trained for what to do with it. We have celibate priesthoods who have a lot of that energy available to them, but because they haven't been trained into its sacredness and into its spiritual uses, it gets perverted into all kinds of things. It's a very, very sad thing. So it's up to us to decide for ourselves what we do with this energy. The second factor in maintaining psychological health is apparent immediately also when you enter into a psych ward. I've actually been in a psych ward where this little woman was saying, they have to let me out of here because I am the only one that knows how to keep the floors clean at the lunch counter. Almost word for word, that was what was said. If we dam up a stream of water, it builds up a tremendous potential. And we have to have the ability to control that potential. And psychic fluency is important to that. But if we have, or to the degree that we have egoism, we block that flow. Because the egoism is me-oriented, and it puts a shield around itself, and it isn't open. And when that happens, that's like damming up the creative force. So, according to this, the best definition of sanity is humility. Because if you are humble, you are open, and the spiritual force can flow through you uninhibited. In fact, you can direct it and use it however you wish. There's no doubt in my mind that if you have a humble person, you have a sane person. Just like we said earlier, a person who's willing to doubt their own sanity is humble. And that is a person who's sane. And that leads us to the final two factors in mental health. If we are divided or inhibited, or we have other kinds of internal hitches, we are not allowing a free flow of life force. Now, we are involved in a society that is increasingly mental in a very restraining way. And in this, Freud was right, that our mentality is not allowing us to feel and is not allowing us to flow. However, he thought in favor of unrestrained, uncontrolled flowing. Freud said that coitus interruptus produces neurosis. And he was correct in that, but his scope was limited to sexual behavior, as most of his views were limited to sexual behavior. And because of that, he was too small to grasp the general principle. It is exceedingly important to psychological and spiritual health to follow through on what you start. Follow through is the third cornerstone. And if you follow through on what you do, there's a feeling of satisfaction. And that it's like feeling healthy. You know, like you wake up in the morning and you feel vigorous. That's physical health. And if you follow through on the things you said you were going to do or set before yourself to do, that same kind of feeling is felt there. Or a similar feeling. Now, moving forward to a spiritual fluency is in a vague way like riding a bicycle. In order to move forward, you have to be balanced. And so the fourth factor in psychic health is balance. There's nothing new in any of the things I'm saying here. It's part of our language. We say that if somebody's in psychological trouble, we say he's mentally unbalanced. Or we say she's off her rocker. Those are, again, things that folk language understands. At present, all of humanity is dangerously unbalanced in favor of materialism. And in effect, we are stretching our psychic constitution to the point that we are facing breaking. You know, like you stretch elastic on an underwear, it starts to break, and that sort of thing is happening. It's possible that in our own time, if we continue with this materialism, that we may have pandemic insanity. When we overvalue some things, we undervalue other things. And one of the things that gets short shrift in our society is emotion. We say, that's only emotion. But emotion is a fact just as much as something material is a scientific fact. Now in this, balance and follow through complement each other. And we can see that easily. If you're going forward, it's easier to balance. If you ride a bicycle fast enough, you can take your hands off the handlebars. They complement each other. So it is our duty and it is our privilege to consciously, in every spiritual school, and both Ford and Jung did it in their psychological practices, they evaluated themselves every day. And when we evaluate ourselves, are we being too mental or are we being too materialistic or something like that? It is our duty. It's also our joy, because when we're balanced, we're happy people. People who have mental problems are very unhappy people. Even neurotics are very unhappy people. So we want to know ourselves with regard to the life force, which is not an easy thing to do. We have all sorts of layers in our, what Freud called the unconscious, and we want to aspire to humility. But you can't humble yourself, because if you humble yourself, that is an act of great egoism. But if you take in things that are gloriously beyond yourself, if you have one look in the spiritual worlds and see that we're not at the top of evolution, but somewhere near the bottom, and there are all these divine beings, one look like that is amazingly humbling. For some people, just walking out and seeing the stars and recognizing how big it all is and how insignificant our part of it seems to be is humbling. Those are things we can practice. We all want to be more constant. We want to carry things out to an end, and that's healthy. So, that's as far as we're going to go with this talk, except to say that what we've talked about today is only half of the study of psychic health. It's the mechanical part. That's one of the weaknesses of all occultism of the kind we study. It's mechanical. We study this world and that world and such like that, when the other side is equally important. Did you know that Madame Blavatsky, when she was a child, steeped herself in every myth that she could get? Because the story side of psychology is equally as important as the mechanical side. And that's all I have to say, except if there are questions, or if you would like an anecdote, I can give you an anecdote. Or have you had enough? I'll send this guy back to Madison. Yes. Did you have a question?
Well, the first cornerstone is related to force.
Yes, that it is proper control of the creative energy, the sex force. The second is humility. The third is follow through. And the fourth is balance. And if you look in psychology books, they don't say it that simply, and they don't say it that directly, but if you look at the people who are successful in what they call psychological cures, those are elements of what they do.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, I'll tell you one story. Or is it too late? Are we going on too long? Well, For 40-some years, I ran Microcosm Bookshop. And all sorts of people came in. All sorts. And there was this young man that came in, and he had a tendency to fall in love with barmaids. And he would talk to them, and he would tell them who they were as what couple in past lives. And they would have had to have been very busy, because they would have had to have been simultaneously in the 3 incarnations at the same time. And he asked me to get him an ephemeris for a certain year. And then I didn't hear from him for a long time. And then I got a phone call from him, and he was in a mental institution. And he asked me whether I would come and visit him. And he was in the ward for the criminally insane. And one of his psychiatrists is a very close friend of mine. And he said that he murdered one, if not both, of his parents, because they put him down and they made him feel like shit. And I got there and visited him, and all it was grandiose delusions. But what happens is I listened to him. And the psychiatrists don't listen. They call it all crazy talk. They won't listen to you at all. They look at that as a symptom rather than as a lead into the soul. And eventually his term was up and he got out. And the first place he came was to Microcosm Bookshop. And he still was filled with delusions. And he had this delusion that in his past life, he was King Arthur. And he wanted to co-opt me into his delusion. And what happened was, in several conversations, he tried everything. He showed me he went to the university, at the University of Wisconsin, and he wrote a term paper on King Arthur. And he wrote in there, he quoted all the things like the Winchester manuscript and Venerable Bede and all of the classical resources for King Arthur. And then he starts to deviate, and the deviation, I don't know what the professor thought when he saw this. The deviations get wilder and wilder. And finally he says, "Why can I say these things so forcefully about King Arthur? Because I am King Arthur." And I missed an opportunity of a lifetime with him. He came into the store, and there were about 4 or 5 of us around. He looks at me and says, "Do you remember when you were Merlin?" And I said, "No, I don't remember that at all." He says, "Sure, you surely know that you were Merlin." I said, "No, I don't think I was Merlin. If I was Merlin, I would be a guy in a side street bookstore." And he kept trying and trying, and he finally realized after about 20 minutes that he wasn't going to co-opt me into his delusion. So he suddenly changes the subject, and he says, "This psalm," and he quotes a psalm. He says, "This means this, doesn't it?" I said, "I don't know. I haven't thought about it. I can't talk about something I don't know." And he persisted several times in that. And I said, "Don't ask me to talk about something I don't know." And he looks at me and he says, "You're supposed to know everything." He gets up and bolts out the door. Before I could say to him, "You're not listening to me, and you didn't listen to me when you were Arthur either." The line of a lifetime, I was out. Any questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.